never knew how to tell you.
I would be able to talk about my life.
I ever loved a lot.
I have two moms.
You want me to say it out loud?
I would kind of go through phases of being really like out there and sort of rejecting what the norm was in school, and then also go through phases of just total conformity where, you know, I would only like wear the jeans that were in and listen to the music that was cool and everything.
I tended to try to fit in with everybody if I could.
In elementary school and junior high school, which personally were really difficult periods of time for me. It was a period of time that I really felt isolated from other students.
It took a lot of encouragement from my parents to get me to even go. And once I went, you know, it took a long time. It took like years before I started to get to know anybody.
Yeah, I have seen a lot of my friends shut themselves off to conform so that they wouldn't, you know, attract attention to be bullied.
I think high school can be a code word for hell.
I may be possibly scared of how people say that they're gonna accept you, whatever you are, and then when you actually tell them like one of your secrets, they don't. It was never the same. We grow apart, and I just don't like that happening to me so many times.
You hear it all the time. You go through school every day hearing, oh, that's so gay, or you're so stupid, you faggot, or something like that. Like, you hear it, and yet the teachers just kind of just turn their head. They're like, oh, well, they're just kids. They're just saying it. They don't really mean it. And they don't really understand the impact that it can have on people.
I remember being out in the country and hearing the unmistakable click of somebody putting a round into a shotgun, chunk. And I heard somebody screaming from across the field, get your out of here before I shoot it away, you queer.
There was one incident in school where I was walking down the hall at lunchtime and I was wearing a shirt that was, you know, had a rainbow on it or whatever. And this guy that I didn't even know just he was a big guy, and he came up to me and he just started screaming at me, like yelling at me, like, you're a dyke, you're an effing dyke, and like all these horrible insults, and just like screaming at my face and like raising a fist to my face, and like I had no idea what to do. I had no one to really go to, and I was really embarrassed, and it was just a really bad moment for me.
Today, our young people, high school and college age, enter the gay community with minds and memories that are understandably blank of any sense of our long history.
I always felt on the margins because my family is mixed. It's African American and Native American. I knew that I was a lesbian, so I felt doubly on the margins of everything.
So it was good to be white, and if you were white, it was good to be blonde and blue-eyed. And if you were blonde and blue-eyed, it was good to be able-bodied and have money and education. So there's all these different layers of expectations of what it is to be, whatever it is I was supposed to be.
Few among straight parents, straight educators, straight media will teach them a single iota of anything positive about our contributions to history.
Like, if they were to look at me, they wouldn't see me as gay. So it makes it kind of easier for me to like weave in and out of the crowd.
As censorship becomes more a fact of American life, they are less and less likely to hear that Walt Whitman was gay, that Eleanor Roosevelt was bisexual, that homosexuals died in Nazi death camps, or that transgendered people enjoyed the extraordinary respect among many native tribes.
I felt kind of uncomfortable at school. I felt that there were certain opinions, certain aspects of myself I didn't express at school because I didn't know how they would be received.
Again and again, when I lecture in schools, I have seen kids' faces light up as they hear about Stonewall and all that went before. Cool, I didn't know that, they say. That newborn sense of history, whether in a tortured underground or the occasional spotlight of fame and leadership, helps our youth to know that they are not alone.
There's been times where I've come out to my peers and people just kind of reject me and just think that I'm just making it up, you know, and it does actually hurt me. So after like coming out to a few people, like, and they'll just be like, you're not gay, you know, you don't look gay, I'll like try to like just hide my identity just to get away from that reaction.
That kind of response is usually what I get because they don't want to seem like a bad person for being homophobic, so they say that they're either joking or that they didn't mean it or that they're not homophobic.
You have to understand, Isabel, that I didn't figure out anything about, didn't know lesbian from a hole in the wall until I was out of high school, out of college.
It wasn't that the high school was not okay with it, it was off the map. I mean, it didn't even exist. Gay people existed, but there was nothing like there is today in terms of there being any kind of support.
When I was in college and doing Dobie Gillis, I went to a camp that was sponsored by UCLA and met a woman there who was a counselor as I was a counselor and fell in love, and we had no idea what that was about because all we knew about being gay, which wasn't a word yet, was that it was a bad thing to be, that you could not succeed or be a part of society if that's who you were. It was really whispered about, not ever talked about.
It was very interesting to figure out who you would want to tell and how you could create community, because that was the biggest deal. How do you find other women who are lesbians? And that was really hard in New York since I was new in New York. It took me a while. Once I found the community of lesbians, that was it, I was out.
When I came out and I started to develop a circle of gay and lesbian friends and those who were accepting, stories would be traded and bits of information would be shared, like, oh, you know, did you know that Alexander the Great was gay or Sappho was a lesbian, you know, especially when I was interested in taking some of these ancient history courses. You know, Walt Whitman was gay and Gertrude Stein was a lesbian, and sort of hearing about historical actors, sometimes very important, whether they're generals or you know, some of the greatest poets in American history, turn out to be gay or lesbian. But knowing individual people and learning a little bit about their biographies is not the same thing as knowing that there's a whole history of a people and that the people that you see yourself as part of have changed and emerged and altered and grown and disappeared and fought, you know, various battles and have been challenged in various ways, but have also resisted in really unique ways, you know, over the past 200 or 300 years.
The way I perceived it as 11, you have to understand there was nothing to read, nothing, you know. It wasn't until I was like in my early 20s where I actually ever read any so-called lesbian literature, which also I found very alienating because it was usually from the perspective of wealthy white women.
In the early 1990s, there was maybe a book or two a year coming out in the field of U.S. gay and lesbian history.
Anyhow, it was Rosa's idea. She wanted to have a secret society where lesbians could meet in each other's houses and dance and have drinks and not get arrested by the police, because the bars were being raided by the police. It was very hard to get anybody to come and join us, and since we didn't know anybody, that was even harder. Plus, there was no magazine, no newsletter, no nothing. The Chronicle wouldn't run anything on it, and so except maybe, you know, the guys had been raided in the bars and taken to jail.
I looked everywhere for a lesbian community, but there was only one organization that was lesbians of color, and they were kind of obscured where they were because they were careful. And this was in the early 70s. I remember one day going to look for them, and they were meeting in a church in the evenings, and I thought I knew where the church was, and I hopped on the train and went down to the village, and it was the wrong church. So I was heartbroken, but I kept looking, and then finally I found this one organization, Salsa Soul Sisters, in Manhattan, and went to a meeting. The next thing that happened was I was invited to join Conditions Magazine Collective, which was a lesbian literary journal. And from that, I started doing more of my writing and developing a stronger community. I'm motivated by being a lesbian feminist, and I'm very excited about how books can excite other people. I'm primarily known for my lesbian vampire fiction. My novel, The Gilda Stories, has been out for a long time, probably since '91. It's kind of a cult classic.
Well, it was a very interesting time at UCLA when I was, after I lost my acting career, I went back to work and I became an assistant and then an associate dean of students. And I was in the office that advises student organizations. You know, you help them get rooms and help them with their programs and kind of make sure they're not breaking the law and stuff like that. And so I was given to advise the SDS, the Progressive Labor Party, the Women's Liberation Front, the Black Student Union, MITCHA, and I mean, there were no deans of color in my office, so I was it. And these students really wanted a revolution. They really understood injustice, and no one was listening to them, and they were trying to make as much noise as possible. The anti-war movement then grew, and it was a part of that. They were finding new solutions for the problems. They were proposing understanding, more than understanding, equality. It was the most pro-democratic, and I mean with a small d, movement I'd ever been in. I loved it. It was really mine, even though I was 9 or 10 years older than they were. And when I went to law school, finally in my 30s, at Harvard, there was just the beginning of queer consciousness. No queer organizations yet, but after I graduated several years later, there were queer organizations. There was queer studies. There was a lot going on after I was out of school.
Well, some of my first activism around gay rights that I remember was at the Briggs Initiative, and they were trying to pass a state initiative around not allowing openly gay people to teach in the schools, public schools, and there was a lot of activism that came up around that time, and particularly in the Bay Area. And so I became involved in that, and I also, when I came up into the Bay Area, because now I was out, you know, so when I came, that was in 1977, when I came out, I became sort of, you know, my activism has really been about cultural work, and as a writer, and in the late 70s, I became involved in the women of color movement and lesbian of color movement, and that's where everything really changed for me. A lot of the work I was doing was around specifically looking at issues that affected women of color in terms of sexual assault. In the 80s, when I was also in New York, I worked for and helped found Kitchen Table Women of Color Press. The majority of us who were in that collective were lesbians of color. So it's kind of like my activism, and you know, I could go on, but my activism around as a lesbian has you know, since the late 70s, you know, and really going into the 80s, has really been defined around women of color movement.
I became aware of my gender identity when I was 4 years old, and I saw the movie Pinocchio. And in the end of the movie, the blue fairy comes down and turns him into a real boy. And I went running home to my mother and I said, Mom, I need a blue fairy. And I was excited about the idea of being a real boy and also kind of pissed off that nobody had told me about the blue fairy up until the time I had seen the movie. Most of my history has been reclaimed through my study of transgender history, through reading about it. And the more that I study transgender history, the prouder I can become of the moments that we have influenced mainstream LGBT civil rights movements. I do work in the Two-Spirit community. Two-Spirits are Native American people who traditionally have been seen to step outside of gender role expectations. So if we look before the conquest, before Columbian conquest, we find groups of people, men who would take on women's roles and women who would take on men's roles, and they actually were seen as third gendered, and they actually were given very respectable places within the community. When it came to other cultural aspects of myself, I'm a person of mixed heritage. I'm Irish, I'm Native American, I'm Mexican, and yet really didn't hear too much about the Mexican aspect, didn't hear too much about the Native American aspect. All of that was underplayed with this idea of, well, you're also Irish, so you should default to that. So all of my cultural identification was kind of hidden from me. If you can't go back and claim your history, you can certainly be a part of making it.
I began to see what I learned in history as useful in helping me develop that political consciousness. Late 80s, early 90s in California, and there were some emerging political battles at that point in time. Pete Wilson, who was our governor at that point in time, as one of his campaign promises, pledged that he would sign a bill making it illegal to discriminate against gay men and lesbians in, I believe, housing and employment. And when he became elected, looking forward to his future prospects in the Republican Party, he vetoed the very bill that he said that he would sign. We went to protest Pete Wilson on the campus at UCLA and all this kind of stuff. So these were really coming together for me. There was something about a meaningful, useful past.
When I was elected in 1994, there was no legislation in California protecting people on the basis of sexual orientation, period. No anti-discrimination stuff, no hate crime stuff, no school stuff, no nothing. The words did not appear in California law. This is 1994. So the first bill that I proposed was to protect students in school against discrimination and harassment on the basis of sexual orientation, and it failed miserably. So I brought it again in '96, and I got some votes, but not enough. Huge debates and discussions. Never had there been conversation about gay and lesbian people and the law in California on the floor of the legislature. And it became the law in California that you cannot discriminate or harass kids on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. It's the question of what is discrimination? What steps must the schools take? How do students affect their own lives in schools? It's still open in a lot of our school districts. And so the Department of Education proposes regulations. There are materials for education. You know, all laws really take people to implement them, and that's what I think this is about.
In history, I learned about the suffragists. I learned about Rosa Parks. I learned about Martin Luther King. I even learned about Mahatma Gandhi, especially during the suffragists. I noticed, like, after they said that the suffragists are fighting for women's rights, and then after that sentence, also LGBTQ civil movement is happening. But after that sentence, there was nothing more about it. And I felt like it was just halfway there.
And our own stories are not only about our struggles or our discrimination or oppression. Our own stories are also not only about our few heroes. I think it's more about day-to-day life. That's why, to me, when we established National Coming Out Day, it was quite an amazing thing from the beginning. It was as though we recognized that the act of coming out was the most important act anyone engaged in, ever. Because what is that about? It's about identity, but it's also about not being invisible. It carries its own risks, but it carries its own joys.
And it was that same sort of process that people felt in the 19th century of kind of emerging from isolation when they learned about Oscar Wilde. I went through that same sort of process in learning through about history, that I was not alone. That when you learn about 200-300 years of gay and lesbian history, you learn that you are not isolated, that you are not alone. Not only are there other people like you in your own time, but there are other people like you throughout history.
We wore t-shirts that said, "Silence equals death." And as we worked on the education pieces in the legislature, we realized that it wasn't just silence, but also invisibility. Invisibility means whatever stories they're telling about you that are negative are the only stories, because we didn't have our own stories.
We barely touched on LGBTQ history. We would study about the ghettos in Warsaw. We would study about the plight of slavery. But gay people? What's that? They exist in history? All the knowledge of queer history that I've picked up from random things. Like, I read Cryptonomicon and found out that the guy who invented computers, Alan Turing, was gay, and the way I figured it out, I read a novel.
That one time, my teacher just kind of just mentioned it, like, as if it was like just an afterthought. And then he just continued on like it was an everyday thing.
I don't think many people realize how many gay people there are out there. And I think we're really sheltered to that, to like the truth about the LGBTQ community.
There was huge opportunity to study and write about topics that had been ignored by mainstream historians for decades. And some might say more than ignored, they were purposefully shunted to the side.
That experience in and of itself reminds me every day of why I do the work that I do. So I'm really aware of the privilege of passing, not only in terms of my race, but in terms of my gender. And there's power and privilege in passing. So I went from being perceived as a poor, mixed-race, Chicano field worker to an upper-middle-class, rich white man in a suit. And it's a different world when you're used to being treated like a second-class citizen to suddenly have white male privilege handed to you on a platter.
I like the idea of leaving behind at least part of my story to be used, because I want to just express how important it is to feel safe enough to be able to say these. We've been doing sensitivity workshops for 6 years. Last year, I was helping to train people to lead the workshops again. And they said, like, you know, like when I was going here, it was okay to say that stuff. It was okay to say, oh, that's gay. Oh, that person's a faggot. Like, and they told me, you can't say that here anymore. That's not right. That's unacceptable. And that's powerful. The ability to like just keep repeating that same message over and over again until people understand that people are just want to be able to tell you, don't want you to necessarily accept it, but just be able to not hide that part of themselves away that makes them them is really important. So that's why I do it.
So when you're faced with discrimination or people stereotype you or anything like that, it can make it really, really hard for you to be able to just be who you're supposed to be or who you want to be. So I think that having safe schools is so important because kids spend a majority of their time there every day of the week. And even when you're not at school, the things that happen to you at school still affect you when you're at home. So it's really important to have a safe environment at school.
The biggest reason for me why I cut my hair was just to be able to do what I wanted to do, just be who I wanted to be without having to follow what people expected out of me. Because growing up, everyone expected me to be more feminine than I actually felt. For the most part, people have been really supportive of me cutting my hair, and it's just amazing how supportive people can be and how open to, I guess, open to change.
The lesson that I learned from the interview is to be patient, because social change takes time.
So, I mean, she had all these obstacles, like they had to get around morality laws, they had to get around pornography laws, they had to get around, like, you know, censorship from, like, the post office. Like, there was a whole argument about whether they could send stuff through the mail, like The Ladder, their magazine. I think that was kind of the most incredible thing, and like how she made it seem effortless. Because she just did it.
Through her words, she kind of showed me the power of really committing to what you believe in, and the power of one person's voice, even though, you know, it's just an individual, but how it can really change people if you really believe in what you're saying. And she also told me, be true to myself and follow my passions, and I think that's really important for young people to do. As long as you are really committed to something, then you can make a lot of good things happen, and you know, influence people if you speak from your heart. Yeah.
I want to use how she said that we're gonna be making history for ourselves in the future, and I want to be part of a history where a lot of people can, you know, read, watch, see, remember me by. That'd be really amazing.